At my cousin's engagement dinner, my grandmother asked, "Still renting?" I said, "No, I own the building you're sitting in." My grandmother set down her champagne flute with a small, precise click that somehow cut through 43 conversations happening simultaneously in the private dining room of the Harborview event space, and she looked at me with the particular expression she reserved for things that disappointed her. Slightly narrowed eyes, a tilt of the chin that communicated both pity and confirmation of a long-held suspicion. And she said in the carrying voice of a woman who had never once in her life been afraid of being overheard, "Still renting that little apartment of yours, Zara?" The table nearest to us went quiet first, then the next one. My cousin Priya, whose engagement dinner this technically was, looked up from the other end of the room with the expression of someone watching a car approach an intersection and calculating whether it was going to stop. My mother, seated 2 chairs down from my grandmother, developed a sudden, intense interest in her bread roll. I set down my own glass and looked at my grandmother, 81 years old, dressed in a silk kurta that cost more than most people's monthly rent, absolutely certain of the answer to the question she had just asked. And I said, clearly enough that the tables that had gone quiet could hear me without straining, "No, Nani, I stopped renting 2 years ago. I own this building." I had been working in commercial real estate investment for 9 years when the engagement dinner happened, which means I had been working in it for long enough to understand several things that my family did not understand and had never asked me to explain. The first was that the building we were sitting in, the Harborview event space, a converted 19th century warehouse on the waterfront that my family had rented for Priya's dinner at $4,800 for the evening, was one of 6 commercial properties held by a limited liability company called Wavecrest Holdings, which I had founded 4 years earlier and which I was the sole managing member of. The second was that my family's understanding of my career had remained at approximately the level it had been when I first started, which was, Zara does something with buildings, probably data entry or office work of some kind. Very steady, nothing exciting. The third was that this understanding was entirely my fault, because I had spent 9 years finding it easier to let them think what they thought than to explain something they had consistently signaled they did not want to understand. I am 34 years old, the granddaughter of a man who built a textile import business from nothing, and a woman who has never in her life underestimated the importance of visible success. And I had spent nearly a decade succeeding in ways my family could not see because I had never shown them where to look. My family is large and opinionated and organized around a set of metrics for success that were established by my grandfather Prakash before he died 11 years ago, and that have been maintained vigorously and without revision by my grandmother Kamala ever since. The metrics are not complicated. Education from a recognizable institution, marriage to someone from an appropriate background, a professional title that can be explained in one sentence to other people at family gatherings, a home that reflects the professional title, and children on a timeline that does not cause anyone to calculate backward. My cousin Priya, who was getting engaged that evening to a cardiologist named Rohan at the age of 29, fulfilled every metric with the precision of someone who had studied the rubric. My cousin Vikram was a corporate attorney. My cousin Sunita was a pediatrician. I was, as far as my family understood it, someone who worked in a real estate office and had not yet gotten married and lived in an apartment that was apparently rented. The apartment was not rented, but more on that. I had taken a different path, not from rebellion, but from genuine interest, which is a less romantic origin story, but a more accurate one. I studied finance at university, graduated with a focus in real estate markets, and took a job at a commercial property investment firm the week after graduation. I was good at it. Good at reading market conditions, good at the financial modeling, good at identifying undervalued properties in neighborhoods where the indicators suggested appreciation was coming, but the price hadn't caught up yet. By 27, I had enough of a track record and enough saved from 4 years of living with conscious frugality to start making my own small acquisitions on the side. A mixed-use building in a transitional neighborhood, a small office block near a university campus. I did this carefully and without announcement, reinvesting returns, compounding slowly, learning what I didn't know from the mistakes that cost me the least. By 30, I had founded Wavecrest Holdings formally and had 4 properties under management. By 32, I had 6. The Harborview building, the event space my family was sitting in, had been my 4th acquisition, purchased 3 years earlier when the previous owner was in financial distress and needed a fast transaction more than a high price. I had paid $2.1 million for it, and its current appraised value was $3.4 million. My grandmother was sitting in a room I owned, drinking champagne on a Thursday evening, asking me if I still rented. The silence after my answer lasted approximately 4 seconds, which is a very long time when 40 people are holding their breath. My grandmother's expression moved through several phases: confusion, recalculation, something that might have been the beginning of reassessment, before she said, with the composure of a woman who had been managing social situations since before I was born, "What do you mean you own the building?" I told her, in the same clear and unhurried voice, that Wavecrest Holdings, LLC, had purchased the Harborview property 3 years ago, and that I was the managing member of Wavecrest Holdings. My Aunt Mina, seated across from my grandmother, made a sound that was not quite a word. My mother put down her bread roll. Priya was watching from across the room with an expression I could not entirely read, part surprise, part something more complicated that I would not fully understand until a conversation we had 3 weeks later. My cousin Vikram, the corporate attorney, said from 3 tables away, in a tone that I recognized as the one he used when he was trying to sound casual about something that had genuinely startled him. "You bought this building?" I said, "Yes." He said, "How?" And I said, "With money," which got a laugh from people who needed the tension to go somewhere. And the dinner continued. The first person I talked to properly after the dinner was my friend and financial advisor, Ananya Krishnaswamy, who had been advising independent investors for 14 years and who had helped me structure several of my acquisitions. She was not at the dinner. She was not family, and the dinner was family. But I called her from my car in the parking structure at 11:30 that night and described what had happened, and she laughed for approximately 30 seconds before she composed herself. She said, "You know they're all going to call you tomorrow." I said I knew. She said, "Do you want to be ready for that?" I asked what being ready looked like. She said it looked like knowing what you want to say and what you don't want to say, and the difference between explaining yourself and justifying yourself, and that I should think carefully about which one I was planning to do. I sat in the parking structure for a few minutes after we hung up, thinking about the distinction, and concluded that she was right, and that the distinction mattered, and that I had not, in 9 years of quietly building something real, figured out yet how to present it to people who had consistently declined to ask about it. The calls came on the following morning, as Ananya had predicted, in a sequence that reflected the family hierarchy with the precision of a system that had been running for decades. My mother first, at 8:15 a.m., her voice doing the particular thing it did when she was simultaneously proud and destabilized and trying to manage both. "Zara, your grandmother didn't sleep well. She wants to understand what you said last night." My Aunt Mina at 9:30, more direct, wanting to know the actual numbers because she was the family member who dealt in actual numbers and had decided that the number I had mentioned warranted real engagement. My uncle Dinesh, who had built his own business in manufacturing, and who I had always respected for the specificity with which he engaged with professional questions, at 10 o'clock, asking me to come for lunch the following week and bring whatever documentation I was comfortable sharing. And then, at 11:45, my grandmother herself, on a call that lasted 22 minutes and that I had been preparing for, in my own way, for years without realizing it. She did not apologize for the renting question. That was not something she would do. But she asked me to explain in detail what I had built, and she listened, actually listened, the way she listened to my grandfather when he was describing the business, and at the end she said, quietly and without the carrying voice she had used at the dinner, "You should have told us." I said respectfully that I had tried to explain my work many times and that it had not generally been a conversation anyone in the family was interested in having. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is fair." From my grandmother, that was significant. The deeper story, the one that took longer to surface, started emerging in the weeks after the dinner and involved not just my grandmother's question, but something else I had discovered during the due diligence for the Harborview acquisition 3 years earlier. This is the part I had not mentioned at the dinner because it required more than a single sentence, and because the dinner was not the right place for it, and because I was still, at the time of the acquisition, working out what to do with what I had found. When I was reviewing the title history and financial records for the Harborview property during the purchase process, my real estate attorney, a woman named Preethi Subramaniam, who had 20 years of practice in commercial property law, and who I had worked with on 4 previous transactions, flagged an irregularity in the chain of title that predated the previous owner by 15 years. The property had changed hands in 2008 through a transaction that Preethi described, when I asked her about it, as unusual in structure, specifically, a sale at significantly below market value to a buyer who appeared to be a related party of the seller, with documentation that was technically complete, but which had the quality of paperwork assembled to support a conclusion rather than to record a genuine arm's-length transaction. She said it was not actionable at that remove and that the title was clean for our purposes, but that the 2008 transaction had the characteristics of a value-stripping arrangement that was common in a specific period of financial distress. I noted it and moved forward with the purchase and filed it in the back of my mind. The 2008 transaction became relevant again 8 months after the dinner, when I mentioned the property's history to my uncle Dinesh over that lunch he had invited me to. Dinesh had been in business in our city for 30 years and had a memory for commercial real estate transactions the way certain people have memories for sports statistics, encyclopedic and immediate. When I described the 2008 transaction and the address, his face did something that was not quite recognition but in its vicinity. He asked me the previous seller's name. I told him. He was quiet for a moment, then said it was connected to a property dispute that had affected several families in the local business community in that period, including tangentially, he chose the word carefully, our own family. He said my grandfather had known about the Harborview building had actually been interested in acquiring it in the early 2000s and had been told by the owner at the time that it was not for sale. Then in 2008, it had sold for considerably below its value to a buyer with no apparent connection to our family or our grandfather's business interests. My grandfather had died in 2013 without ever mentioning this to anyone, as far as Dinesh knew. But Dinesh said he had a folder of documents from that period, correspondence and valuations, and some notes my grandfather had made, and he thought I should see them. The folder Dinesh gave me 2 weeks later contained 43 pages of documents that I took directly to Preethi Subramaniam's office and spread across her conference table. She reviewed them over 2 hours while I sat and drank the coffee her assistant brought and tried not to get ahead of myself. When she finished, she looked up and said that what she was reading suggested my grandfather had been in active negotiations to purchase the Harborview property in 2006 and 2007, had made a formal offer, and had been told the property was being taken off the market for family reasons. The 2008 sale to the related party buyer had occurred 14 months after my grandfather's offer was declined. The sale price in 2008 was $680,000. Preethi pulled the comparable transactions for that period and placed them next to the document. The market value in 2008, even in the distressed post-crisis environment, was approximately $1.4 million. The property had been sold for roughly half its value, in a transaction that benefited a buyer with a documented financial relationship to the seller, within 2 years of my grandfather being told it was unavailable. Preethi said this did not meet the legal threshold for anything actionable at this distance in time, and did not constitute fraud in any recoverable sense. It was a story about an opportunity that had been managed out of my grandfather's reach. I asked her if she could identify who the 2008 buyer was, beyond the name I had in the title records. She said she would look into it. The buyer's identity was the piece that made everything else rearrange. Preethi's research, delivered in an email with 4 attachments on a Monday morning 3 weeks after I gave her the documents, established that the 2008 buyer, the entity named in the transaction, was a holding company whose beneficial ownership traced, through 2 intermediate entities, to a business partner of the seller, who had been in a commercial dispute with my grandfather's textile import business in 2005 and 2006. The dispute was documented in records Preethi had located in the Commercial Court Archive. A contract disagreement over distribution terms, resolved through negotiation, officially amicable. But the timeline, dispute with my grandfather, negotiation, resolution, then a property my grandfather wanted sold to a related party at half value, had a shape that I sat with for several days before I knew what to do with it. I called Ananya. I called Dinesh. I spent an evening with a property litigation attorney named Siddharth Rao, who had 19 years of experience in commercial property disputes, and who reviewed everything Preethi had assembled and confirmed, with the careful precision of someone who had given this kind of assessment many times, that the information was historically significant and legally inert. Too old, too indirect, too dependent on inference to support a claim. The story was real. The remedy was gone. What remained was the knowledge. And I made a decision about what to do with the knowledge that took me approximately 3 weeks of intermittent consideration. The decision was to tell my grandmother, not as an accusation, not as a grievance, but as information. The kind of information that a family deserved to have about its own history, even if nothing could be done with it, even if the person responsible was almost certainly dead and the money was gone and the opportunity had been diverted into a chain of transactions that had eventually deposited the property into my hands for $2.1 million. I told her on a Saturday afternoon at her house, sitting at the kitchen table where she had been sitting for 40 years, with Dinesh present, because he had been part of finding the story, and because his presence meant the conversation had a witness. I laid out the documents in order. I explained what they showed. I explained what Preethi had said about the legal situation, and what Siddharth Rao had confirmed. My grandmother listened with the focused attention she brought to things that mattered to her, the attention that had built and sustained a family through several decades of difficulty and change, and when I finished, she sat quietly for a moment and then said, "Your grandfather knew something was wrong with that transaction. He told me once that the building had been taken from under him, and I told him he was imagining things." She looked at the documents on the table. He wasn't imagining things. We sat with that for a while. The dinner's aftermath continued to reverberate in the family in ways I had not entirely anticipated. My cousin Priya called me 3 weeks after the engagement dinner for the conversation I had seen coming in her expression across the room that evening. She was not angry. Priya has never been primarily angry. She processes things differently. But she was thoughtful in a way that required more from me than the usual family conversation. She said she had not known the dinner was at a building I owned. She said she had been the one who selected the venue after finding it on an event booking platform, and that when she saw my face at the moment my grandmother asked the renting question, she had understood immediately that I had not arranged this, that it was genuinely coincidental, and that the coincidence was going to require some navigation. I confirmed all of this. She asked me why I had never told the family what I was building. I said what I said to Ananya in the car park, which was that I had tried to explain my work and it had not generally generated interest, and that over time I had stopped trying and started simply doing, and that the result was a version of success that existed in a kind of parallel register from the family's awareness. Priya was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's lonely." It was accurate. I said yes. The conversation with my mother happened over a long weekend when she came to stay with me, and it was the most important conversation of the whole period. My mother is a woman who had spent her adult life navigating the expectations of my grandmother and the shadow of my grandfather's legacy, and the particular pressure of being the daughter who was considered reliable rather than exceptional. And she had managed all of it with a grace that I had not fully appreciated until I understood more about what it cost. She walked through my apartment, which I had owned for 3 years, purchased at the same time as the Harbor View building as part of the same portfolio expansion, a 2-bedroom in a building 2 blocks from the waterfront, with the expression of someone taking inventory of something they had misread. She asked to see the Wavecrest Holdings documents. I showed her the portfolio summary that Ananya had prepared for my annual review. 6 properties, total acquisition cost $9.8 million, current appraised value $14.2 million, annual net operating income $780,000. My mother sat at my kitchen table and looked at the document for a long time. Then she said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I told her the honest answer, which was that I had told her, several times, in the language of someone who was excited about their work and wanted to share it, and that the response had consistently been a kind of pleasant acknowledgement that moved immediately to other topics, and that I had eventually concluded the information was not landing and had stopped offering it. She said, "I didn't understand what you were telling me." I said I knew. She said, "I should have asked more questions." I said I thought that was true. We sat in the kitchen and drank tea, and then we cooked dinner together and talked about other things, and it was, I think, the beginning of a different kind of conversation between us that we have been having since. My grandmother invited me to lunch 6 weeks after the Saturday conversation about the documents, just the 2 of us, at the restaurant near her house where she had been having lunch on Sundays since before I was born. She had dressed carefully, which she always did, but there was something in her manner that was different from the manner she used at family gatherings. Less performance, more attention. She asked me about the portfolio with the specificity of someone who had been reading about commercial real estate since our last conversation, which I found both startling and touching. She asked about vacancy rates and lease structures and what I looked for in an acquisition target. I answered all of it. At the end of the meal, she said, "Your grandfather would have found you very interesting." It was not an apology. My grandmother does not apologize, which I had understood since childhood and had made a kind of peace with. It was something else. Recognition, perhaps, delivered in the register available to her. I said I thought my grandfather and I would have had good conversations. She agreed. We ordered dessert. The afternoon light came through the restaurant window and she talked about my grandfather's business, the early years, the decisions he made, the properties he had wanted and not gotten. And I listened in a way I had not been prepared to listen when I was younger and had not known yet what the story contained. I have thought about that lunch many times since. Wavecrest Holdings acquired a 7th property 4 months after the engagement dinner. A mixed-use building in a neighborhood where the indicators I track had been moving in a consistent direction for 18 months. Ananya reviewed the financial model and said it was the strongest acquisition I had brought her in 4 years. Preeti handled the transaction documentation. Siddharth Rao, who I had started using for general commercial counsel beyond the one consultation, reviewed the title history and found it clean. The building settled on a Friday afternoon, and I sat in Preeti's office signing the final documents and felt the specific satisfaction of a completed thing. Not triumph, not vindication, just the clean feeling of something done correctly. I called Dinesh on the way home because he had become, in the months since the folder conversation, the family member I talked to most frequently about work, and he asked about the new acquisition with the informed interest of someone who had been paying attention. He said my grandfather would have liked the deal structure. I said I had been thinking the same thing. I drove home through the waterfront neighborhood where the Harbor View building sat, and I slowed down slightly as I passed it, not because I needed to, just because some things deserve acknowledgement even when no one is watching. And then I drove on. I am 34 years old and I own 7 commercial properties, and I have learned several things about family and visibility and the specific cost of being comprehensible to people who have not asked to understand you. The first is that success practiced in private is not the same as success that exists only for yourself. The work is real regardless of whether anyone is watching, and the portfolio grew with or without family awareness, and I do not regret the years of quiet building. The second is that visibility matters in ways I underestimated, not for validation, but for connection, and that the people who love you cannot celebrate what they do not know, and that I had made it unnecessarily difficult for them to know by mistaking their earlier inattention for permanent indifference.